In our last video, we looked at the graph of the sine function given the unit circle. In this video, we're going to continue on and sketch the graph of the cosine function from the unit circle, and then talk about both the sine and cosine functions as we go past one rotation or in the negative direction. So recall our unit circle, and remember what happens as we travel around the unit circle. For each point on the unit circle and its corresponding angle, the x-coordinate will represent the cosine of that angle. The y-coordinate will represent the sine of that angle. Now we use that information to construct some ordered pairs so that we can sketch the graph. So let's do that for cosine. Okay, so remember I switched all my angles to radians so that I could talk about plotting the points on the real axes. So when theta is 0, the cosine of 0 is 1. When theta is pi over 6, it's the square root of 3 over 2. Pi over 4, the square root of 2 over 2. Pi over 3, 1/2, and pi over 2, 0. Now we can continue on. Now notice as we move into the second quadrant, our cosine values become negative, which should make sense as our x values are negative. So let's get all that on the screen. So 3 pi over 4, the cosine of 3 pi over 4 is negative square root of 2 over 2. The cosine of 5 pi over 6 is negative square root of 3 over 2. And the cosine of pi is negative 1. And as we did before, let's write the values, or approximate values, over here so that we can plot our ordered pairs. So 1 will stay 1. The square root of 3 over 2 was about 0.866. The square root of 2 over 2 was 0.707, or about 1/2, 0.5. And let me continue on in this way so that we can get this graph graphed. Negative square root of 3 over 2 is negative 0.866, and negative 1 is 1. So just to write down a couple of ordered pairs to help us sketch, we know that 0 gets mapped to 1. Pi over 6 gets mapped to about 0.866. Pi over 4 gets mapped to about 0.707. Pi over 3 gets mapped to about 0.5. And pi over 2 gets mapped to 0. Then we move on into the second quadrant, and we have 2 pi's over 3 gets mapped to negative 0.5. 3 pi over 4 gets mapped to negative 0.707. 5 pi over 6 gets mapped to negative 0.866. And pi gets mapped to negative 1. So let's now take these ordered pairs and plot them on our graph. This top graph we did already was the sine of x. This bottom one will represent the cosine of x. So let's write that. F of x equals the cosine of x. So let's start plotting some of our points. We see that 0, 1 is on our graph. All right. Then pi over 6 will get mapped to about 0.866, which sits up about here. Pi over 4 will get mapped to 0.707, which sits somewhere about there. Pi over 3 gets mapped to 1/2, and pi over 2 gets mapped to 0. So in this first quadrant, we have this curve coming down. Okay, now let's see what happens as we travel from pi over 2 to pi. So 2 pi's over 3 gets mapped to negative 0.5. 3 pi over 4 gets mapped to negative 0.707, which sits about there. 5 pi over 6 gets mapped to negative 0.866, which sits somewhere about there. And pi gets mapped to negative 1. So we come around this time like this. Okay? Now let's plot some points from pi to 2 pi. Let's come back over here and make a chart. We can probably go through this one faster as we've already done this several times now. So again, let's get my unit circle back up here. All right, let's see what happens. When we are at 7 pi over 6, the cosine of 7 pi over 6 is negative square root of 3 over 2, which is about negative 0.866. 5 pi over 4 gives negative square root of 2 over 2, which gives about negative 0.707. 4 pi over 3 gives about negative 1/2, or exactly negative 1/2, which gives me negative 0.5. 3 pi over 2 gives me 0. And then moving around in my last quadrant, I will get the values 1/2, square root of 2 over 2, square root of 3 over 2, and 1. And likewise, we get 0, 0.5, 0.707, 0.866, and 1. Now let's go ahead and plot these points on our graph to finish up one rotation for cosine. Okay, see if I can get that all on there. It's a trick. Okay. So when we are at 7 pi over 6, we're back up to negative 0.866. When we are at 5 pi over 4, we are at negative 0.707. When we are at 4 pi over 3, we're at negative 1/2. And when we're at 3 pi over 2, we're back up to 0. Okay, so we should have a curve up like this. Now let's go to this last quadrant. So pi, starting at 3 pi over 2, past that. So now we're at 5 pi over 3, and we are at 1/2. And then we're at 7 pi over 4, so back to 0.707. 11 pi over 6 gives us about 0.866. And then 2 pi back to 1. And so we should now have this curve. Okay? And so there's the graph of f of x equals cosine of x for one full rotation about the circle. So the next question to ask is, what happens as we move past the unit circle, or past one rotation? So what do you think would happen? Again, we need to refer to our unit circle, and let's just look and see if we can make a deduction. So remember, this is one full rotation about the unit circle. Well, if I go around the unit circle once and then I continue to go around the unit circle, so 30 degrees past 360, so in this case this would be 390 degrees, I would really be at the same place where 30 degrees was. So I would be right back here. Likewise, if I kept going, I would start tracing this graph of the sine of x for the first 2 pi again this way. Okay? Now, let's see what happens if I go to the left. Well, it's the same thing, except now we're going to go in a negative direction, right? So when I go negative 30 degrees, instead of being at 1/2, I'll be at negative 1/2. If I go negative 45 degrees, instead of being at the square root of 2 over 2, I'm going to be at negative square root of 2 over 2. And so what that's going to give me is a graph that looks like this. And then we're going to curve back up and hit pi. And then we're going to keep going till we hit 1 up there, and then back down to 2 pi. And if I keep going, I will repeat the sine of graph to the negative direction in the same way. What do you think happens as we go the negative direction for cosine? Well, notice if I go to the negative direction, my x values stay positive. Okay, so I really should mimic this as I go from 0 to negative pi over 2. Now, if I continue on into the third quadrant in this negative direction, well, then my coordinates become negative. So I should look like this. I'm still negative as I move along this way. And then I become positive again as I move back to 2 pi. Okay? There are the graphs of sine of x and cosine of x.